The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene.
Hi, this is Grace.
And you are with us at the Durian Heat, where we discuss critical issue, this time in Malaysia. So, when we talk about Malaysia, of course, the current hot news item is about POTA, or POTA stands for the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So in this context, we invited two. I'm not sure whether they are opposing to each other, or they would be agreeing with each other at the end of the day. But it's regarding on POTA. Is it a Malaysian terror? And we have Elina Noor representing ISIS Malaysia. She's the assistant director there. And of course, we have the infamous Paulsen, the executive director for Lawyers for Liberty. So welcome to the studio.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Hi, morning.
So before we start our discussion, I guess just a bit of introduction about POTA. Maybe both of you can share what essentially POTA is about. Yeah, maybe you can start with Elina first.
Sure. I just, I have to make the usual disclaimers before I go on. These are my personal opinions. They don't reflect my institute's. But so POTA, to my understanding, is a response to I want to say growing threat of terrorism, but we've had this threat for a really long time now. What's new about it is the nature of the threat. The recruitment, the speed and efficacy of recruitment of young people through social media and other modes of technology are posing a different kind of challenge to law enforcement authorities. And POTA is supposed to address these challenges. That's what we've been hearing from the government. I know there are some concerns about it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But essentially, what's been said about POTA is that it's meant to supplement the inadequacies of old laws that could not cope with this new type of terror threat that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. But from your perspective, what do you think of POTA? I mean, being in the civil society especially.
Well, essentially, I think for Lawyers for Liberty and I think a lot of civil society organization, I think the most basic rule is that detention without trial is wrong in whatever manner or form. Because at the end of the day, if someone is guilty of any particular offense, whether supporting terrorism or engaging or commissioning acts of terror, then I think they should be brought to trial through the normal rules of procedure and evidence in court. Unlike POTA, where basically someone would be detained for initially 60 days, and then the person can be detained up to 2 years without trial. And this can go on indefinitely. So basically, technically it's possible for somebody could be incarcerated for a long time, 2 years plus 2 years plus 2 years.
This particular law sounds very similar to a law that we recently abolished, which is the ISA. So I'm just wondering, like in the past, when Malaysian government wants to curtail any terrorist activity, I believe they would use ISA. But is there any procedure or mechanism that the government, Malaysian government, used to curtail terrorism in the past?
Well, they've used existing laws, of course, and those have been criticized as well. So it's tough. When you talk about national security, obviously you have to protect civil liberties as well. And I think it's not just Malaysia, but all countries are finding where this balance lies very difficult, because as we're finding out, the threat of terrorism is evolving to be very dynamic. And unfortunately, laws are not as dynamic. But I think legislation is only one part of it, and maybe we can go into this later. But obviously, it's a very controversial aspect of how we counter terrorism in Malaysia as well as abroad.
In other countries, how would they deal with terrorist activities? Would they have a similar POTA law as well?
Well, I think be a stretch to say that they have similar POTA laws. You know, a lot of countries, Australia, Canada, and Britain, they do have similar concerns in the sense that a lot of their young people are also traveling to Syria and Iraq. You know, in this misguided understanding that they're going to go to heaven if they were to fight in this particular war. But in none of these countries they have laws similar to POTA. Of course, you know, there are offences that they can commit, but certainly none of them would be detained for 60 days without trial initially, and then for another 2 years. So they might be investigated for, I think the maximum is probably 2 weeks, and then they would have to release them if there's no offence that has been committed. So if there is an offence, then they might be charged for whatever offences they might have committed. So it would be certainly be a stretch to say that there are similar POTA laws in these countries.
What about you, being in this area?
I think the iterations are a little different, but obviously all these countries face a similar threat, as Eric said. We've seen in recent times Australia really struggling with this issue. How do you prevent youngsters from leaving the country in the first place to travel to places like Iraq and Syria without infringing upon their freedom of movement? Similarly, in the UK, they just enacted new legislation which has also received a lot of pushback from civil liberty activists. And in the US, this has been going on since, I guess, infamously, the 9/11 debate about, it first started off with a debate about the Patriot Act, and then the reach of surveillance. So all these countries face very different sets of challenges in how you prevent terrorism. Detention without trial is certainly a concern, but it's one of those many concerns that all countries are struggling with right now.
So the spirit of Malaysia's POTA law, is it emulating any other existing law that probably in India or any other country?
I don't think so. I think Malaysia is only one of the few countries that's actually stuck in the past. And I think a lot of countries, even though they realize that terrorism is it could be seen to be a bit different type of crime than, let's say, robbery or murder. But nonetheless, I think there's always a healthy respect for civil liberties, and that detention without trial under any circumstances is normally not acceptable. But unfortunately, Malaysia is instead of looking to the future, it's always stuck in the past, because detention without trial is very seductive, because at the end of the day it's a very easy way of doing things, because at the end of the day you can make all kinds of allegation, and you don't need to prove it, so you can just make allegation and it is more or less taken as the gospel truth, and then the person would be, his liberties will be taken away, and he'll be detained without trial for up to 2 years. So it's very easy to do. It promotes lazy investigation. Resources are being misused, and at the end of the day, they can comply with whatever requirements in terms of KPI, in terms of X number of people to be arrested, X number of people to be detained. So it is very efficient in that sense. But whether we are getting the right person, we will never know. Whether innocent people are being incarcerated without trial, and not forgetting families of people who have been detained. I think this is one of the casualties of war, which most people do not talk about.
So your biggest concern when it comes to POTA is the detention without trial. But what about the whole POTA Act itself? Do you find it problematic?
Yes, and I think the detention without trial is one of the biggest
concern.
It's a biggest concern, because the slight differences between POTA and ISA is that they seem to be pushing the responsibility towards a committee. So instead of under the ISA in those days, the sole discretion is with the minister. So they've pushed it to a committee, which basically creates an impression that it is something quasi-judicial, which is wrong, because there's nothing quasi-judicial about it. At the end of the day, this is just a committee that sits in secret, God knows where. So it's a very Kafkaesque trial, so to speak. The person who is being arrested accused of a certain crime would not really know what accusation they have against him or her, and the evidence against him or her is also kept secret. So you have a secret accusation, you have a secret trial, secret evidence. You don't know where you're being detained. Very few people would have access to you, and at the end of the day, you are just lost in this labyrinth of anti-terrorism legislation.
So, in your opinion, that basically POTA is taking away the freedom of speech, basically, and also, then do you agree that the whole this important decision, especially the law, was rushed? The debate. This is such an important law that the debate should have been done in a more appropriate manner.
Well, certainly, but unfortunately, Malaysia, this is not just the only law that is being rushed, because even for the draft bill, this was only given to the members of parliament the day that it's going to be debated. So in a real first world democracy, certainly these laws would be debated much longer. Press will be talking about it, civil society will be talking about it, but unfortunately, this was rushed through, within a few days, and it was voted at the wee hours of the morning. So certainly not a good start for such a law with so much of powers to take away someone's liberty.
But the interesting part of the POTA bill that is being tabled in the Malaysian Parliament is it was already announced probably in March, if I'm not mistaken, or late February. So in a way that why only the hype against POTA started during the debate of the bill?
I think a lot of the consternation surrounding POTA. You're right. There was sort of a build-up to expect the tabling of POTA, but a lot of the consternation surrounds the fact that details were not released about what POTA would contain. And I think there was a lot of interest, not only from parliamentarians and lawyers, but also from civil society about specific provisions of POTA. Because the political climate has been such that, unfortunately, there is not a lot of trust among many parties in society. And so legislation is always grounded in context, and how you apply laws is always grounded in what's going on socially. So, given what's been happening in recent weeks, rightly or wrongly, the perception has been created that there is a concentration of power in the executive. And of course, the executive might not agree with this, but the fact is that perception is there. And unfortunately, it's that perception that has created a lot of the controversy and debate surrounding POTA. Of course, I think there could have been a better way to introduce POTA, but many things can be improved on hindsight.
Perception aside, I would like to know your point of view, because I believe you probably know more about Prevention Terrorism Act in other countries as well besides Malaysia. If you were to analyze maybe some of the key aspects of POTA, do you think it is necessary to have clauses where the terrorists or suspected terrorists needs to be detained without trial, or they should be trialed secretly? What do you think of this?
I think every country is going to come up with a law that best fits its context. And we can debate about the provisions of every single piece of legislation that's been passed in different countries. Certainly there are concerns about the absence of judicial review of the substance of proceedings under POTA. There is judicial review for procedure, so in theory at least that is sort of a safeguard. I know Eric will probably disagree with me. But I think there are also questions about other provisions of POTA. For example, the appointment of an inquiring officer. I think it'd be good to have a set of criteria listed for a particular inquiring officer. So at least there is a baseline upon which we can determine whether an inquiring officer is fully capable of conducting that inquiry, particularly when these cases are shrouded in secrecy. I think what's also important is to look at the flip side from a law enforcement agent's perspective. With SOSMA, they had 28 days, and some would argue that that's not a lot of time to gain evidence. Of course, the flip side to that argument is that, well, the police will just have to do a lot more hard elbow grease in terms of conducting investigative work. But under SOSMA, the police did what they could, and so far we've been blessed, we haven't seen any terrorist attacks.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question under POTA is, and it's always a counterfactual, right? Mm-hmm. With all these pieces of legislation, is it the fact that these laws worked in the past that we haven't had a terrorist attack, or is it because of other circumstances? Mm-hmm. And I think it's contributed towards it. But as we mature as a democracy, we need to also mature our laws and how we conduct investigations, how we conduct proceedings, even in the face of terrorism.
Before I let Eric to reply on that, I'm sure you have something to say, but I want to know, do you necessarily think that POTA will lead to lazy investigation?
No, I think credit should be given where it's due, and I think the security agencies, law enforcement agencies, have been quite professional in conducting investigations into acts of terror. I've spoken to a number of them, and I trust that they've been very professional in doing so. Unfortunately, our encounters with the police force
again perception.
Again perception, and I think whatever laws you give the police, they will have to work within those confines, because that's just the way it is. But I think if we were to put ourselves in their shoes, if, for example, we come up against a case where someone's being radicalized mm-hmm. quite quickly, and it's really difficult to figure out how an individual is going to move from that radical point to violent extremism. But as the police, you need to stop that person before something devastating happens. Where is that line that you draw, and what kinds of laws are you going to depend on that will allow you that provision and liberty of sorts to prevent something from happening? So I think it's absolutely necessary that we air our criticisms. But on the flip side, I think we should also be constructive and come up with suggestions, alternative suggestions, if there are any, and really try and put ourselves in the shoes of the other, when they're doing operational work.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what Elina said. I think there's a trust deficit here, because our police force, I think everyone would agree, it's a very politicized police force. It's all powerful, and of course the power is centralized. With POTA, as I said, it promotes lazy investigation, and of course a lot of resources have been misused in the past, and I think resources have also is currently being misused. If you look at the budget in terms of how much a special branch gets, it is almost equivalent to the CID, Criminal Investigation Department. And of course, we know that the special branch, its origin was to, is counter insurgency, but nowadays it is mainly being used to spy on the opposition, to harass the opposition, to arrest them, and things that is technically not the business of a police force, because their role is to prevent and detect real crimes, not political crimes. So on the one hand, you have huge resources which is being misused, that is anti-democracy, and then now, because these resources are being misspent in this way, the real resources should be diverted to actually prevent terrorism offences, which I think they are trying to catch up now. It's not too late, but what I'm trying to say is that if they had used the resources properly in the past, then probably we wouldn't see the problem as we are seeing right now, where a lot of young men and women are deciding they are now radicalized, when this could have been prevented if the special branch had done their work properly.
Anyway, we'll take one short break. When we return, we will discuss again.
The Durian Heat. bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene and we are back again with Elina, Noor and of course Eric Paulsen on the topic regarding POTA. Is it a Malaysian terror? So continuing our discussion today on the Prevention of Terrorism Act. I guess one of the G's of the discussion will be how much of it is perception, how much of it is reality. And when it comes to the fear that government might misuse POTA, not to capture terrorists or to prevent terrorism activities, but in fact it might be used against politicians or people who are just against the government in general. But in your own point of view, both of you, I'm asking, do you think that the clause, I think there's one clause where it says that it doesn't really cover political activity. Do you think do you think the clause itself is relevant or not? Whether POTA might be misused by those people with personal interests within the government?
The particular clause says that somebody shouldn't be detained purely for its political views. But that has been defined quite restrictively, in the sense that they must be registered to an organisation under the Societies Act. So technically, if you want to misinterpret the law, which the authorities are prone to doing, technically a group like BERSE, a large civil society organisation, which basically wants to affect change through maybe street protests among other means. Technically, if they want to misinterpret the law, it may be possible to say that the acts of BERSE, for example, could be prejudicial to state security. While it might not fall cleanly under POTA, but it is not the first time. If let's say the authorities would like to misuse the law, to misinterpret the law, they could use it against BERSE if they want to. And I don't say this very lightly, because in the past we have seen under the ISA, Teresa Kok was arrested under ISA, a journalist was arrested under ISA.
But that was of a different period, during Tun Mahathir's time. So perhaps there's some personality politics happening at that time. But in this current context, where there's just social media and there's an open space for people to debate and to discuss about whether the act is being used or is being misused by the authorities. Do you think POTA itself has a lower threshold in comparison to, for example, the Sedition Act, or do the authorities need to prove that this particular, for example, BERSE is a terrorist organisation that is terrorizing people?
I would think the reverse is true, because currently over the last few months we have seen more than 100 arrests, politically motivated arrests under the Sedition Act and under Peaceful Assembly Act and the Penal Code, and we all know that all these arrests are purely harassment, detaining somebody overnight or getting remanded purely for the sake of punishing them pre-trial, and this is happening right now. And of course, when it comes to POTA, it is even less judicial scrutiny, because essentially it is detention without trial, and the scope of judicial intervention is much more limited, because it's only available for habeas corpus for procedural ground. But at the very least, if this Sedition Act is being misused or the Peaceful Assembly Act is being misused, you would still need to come to trial, in a sense that the person who's being accused still has his or her day in court. But with POTA, the scope for abuse is much wider, certainly.
Do you think the same as well?
Look, I think this is where it gets hairy, because a lot of countries, a lot of agencies define terrorism and acts of terror as it's to affect political or ideological change, essentially. And I think that particular clause that you're both referring to is sort of compromise to allay fears that POTA will be misused. Now, whether or not those concerns will turn out to be true remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of suspicion that it will be misused, but it's probably too early to say with POTA. And so if we define terrorism as a means to affect political change, and at the same time POTA allows for the fact that a person cannot be arrested solely for their political beliefs, that again is a really fine distinction to draw, because when does a political belief become radical? Even worse, become extreme. And so that's obviously up for interpretation. And I think it would really help in this case if we had a strong system of checks and balances in place in the country. So if the legislation says this and it's open to interpretive abuse, then ideally we would have a strong, robust judiciary to counter that, even if it's after the fact. It's really important in this particular case where terrorism threats are up in play, that you have this check and balance, because we're a democracy.
Let's talk about terrorism in this country. In terms of the statistic, there are more and more younger generation that are joining ISIS, not just in Malaysia but the whole of Southeast Asia. Of course, and the threat is real, and it's not just about ISIS, it's also about security threats like we see in Lahad Datu, and I guess the question that I want to clarify from you all is, with all these different threats, either it's coming from religious, it comes from border security, or it comes from ideological, how do you know it has gone beyond the extreme end of it? Because anyone can have an idea, anyone can feel strongly about certain things, but how much of what you feel can be harmful to the rest of society?
This is where it gets really difficult, and it's difficult to address this through legislation, because you have to be able to figure out what that exact point is when someone crosses the line between having radical, strong opinions to actually committing a violent act of terror. And I think, as we mentioned earlier, legislation is only one part of how we counter terrorism. There has to be a before and after, right? So you have to counter all those steps that lead up to that point of terrorism, including structural issues like education, encouraging critical thinking, critical analysis in the face of pure dogma, and after the fact. So after an act of terror has been committed, have an effective de-radicalization program, which is what our country does have, or what other countries in the region do have, where you engage not only the detainee, but you also engage the detainee's environment, the family, friends, so that the detainee has a supportive environment even as he's being rehabilitated. Now, not everybody is going to be able to be de-radicalized. We've already had examples of that. For example, Yazid Sufaat. Some people are going to remain hardcore no matter what you do with them, and unfortunately those will fall through the cracks. But the majority, hopefully, with a comprehensive whole of society approach, that means we don't just depend on the police, we don't just depend on the law, but everyone has a role to play. You and I have a role to play. In an ideal world, if we all get together and do our bit, no matter how small, we'll be able to reduce that pool of radicalization.
But what about sympathizers and supporters? Because, okay, it's easy to justify, I'm going to arrest you because you went to Syria, there's video of you, beheading people, for example. But what about the sympathizer and the supporter of these young kids? Because for example, if you go to one of the Facebook page of one of the young Malay who went to Syria and Iraq, what you see is a lot of people actually sharing their sympathy. Are they also subject to the POTA Act if the government wants to?
Technically, yes. I mean, the way it has been drafted is very wide. So it's not been defined what is engaged, supporting, commission. But if I just like to address a further issue that was raised by Elina, and I think it's very crucial that we don't just use laws to try to prevent and stop such extremism. I think we need to address the root causes. I know the words like root causes is normally bandied about without really going in depth what it actually means. For me personally, I think we need to be to take a very good hard look at what has been happening over the last 2-3 decades. The type of messages that is being sent out to in these madrasas that is not generally not governed. The type of books that's been brought in from Saudi, for example.
The Friday sermons also?
Well, I mean, that is another aspect. Of course, sometimes words are being used very, very loosely. Jihad, for example. Sometimes words like this is a Christian, Jewish, communist, US. Israeli propaganda.
But then, if I use your logic, that means almost everyone that use extreme views to promote a radical ideology could be subjected under POTA, right? I mean, just to go back again.
Well, again, it comes to interpretation and law enforcement, and to what level someone has committed a crime by merely, for example, liking a Facebook. So, is it really an offense, or must it be something much more than just liking a Facebook? So, you must take steps to actually. You want to do something much more than just that. The point I'm making is that there is a disconnect between young people mainly in terms of what they are doing day to day, and at the same time the very seductive message that if I were to do A, B, C, D, E, despite what are the wrongs that I've done in my life in Malaysia, this can be wiped out the moment I were to take this part and I'll go to heaven. And I think the authorities need to really counter such a very misguided message.
We'll take one short break. When we return, we will go back again to the discussion on POTA.
The Durian Heat, bringing big ideas and critical opinions in Southeast Asia.
Hi, this is Arlene.
Hello, this is Grace.
And of course, we are back again with Elina Noor as well as Eric Paulsen on the discussion about POTA. Is it a Malaysian terror? So, actually, there's a curiosity within myself regarding why the government is rushing for this bill. Do you think because of Malaysia's role as the chairman of ASEAN, there's a pressure for us to prove that we are actually pushing forward against preventing terrorism activities in Southeast Asia? Because, I mean, ministerial meeting have been called to somehow push for an ASEAN level of anti-terrorism act. But do you think Malaysia's national level of having a piece of a similar law like POTA is just, part of the few steps that Malaysia is taking in preventing terrorism?
I think our image in ASEAN is secondary, really, to the passage of POTA. To my mind, I'm not really sure if this is true or not, but to my mind, POTA was tabled and rushed through, if you will, because of primarily our national security threat. I think in the past we've taken what's been happening abroad in Iraq and Syria quite lightly because it's been so distant. But because we've had, now nearly 70 people who've been involved with groups like IS and similar to that in Iraq and Syria, that we're starting to get more than a little just concerned. We've seen the videos, we've seen the pictures. In the past, sure, we had people who went to Afghanistan, tried to go to Palestine, all that, to fight what they thought was jihad. But the pictures of our kids standing next to severed corpses, liking videos of beheadings and all, I think that's really something that's very jarring to many Malaysians now. It's sort of a new development. And I think it's not only the security agencies, but many Malaysians are trying to grapple not only with these acts themselves, but the mere thought of how kids can even begin to be sensitized to these very startling images.
I actually have this idea. Whenever the government talks about education system, whenever they table a blueprint, they will have all this, framework. Although, people criticize the framework, but at least they have something, just to somehow address, or this is the kind of education system we will have probably for the next 5 years. But for preventing terrorism activities, do you think, because you mentioned a lot about the whole ecosystem of preventing it, not just the law but also the education, the way the messages that we get every day from religious leaders and from society, do you think maybe Malaysian government should have some form of framework to prevent terrorist activities in a way that it can show that this is not this piece of law is not to be abused, but is part of the larger campaign by the government to somehow prevent terrorist activities and radical ideologies?
2 points to that. One, I think that any campaign to sort of allay people's concerns about POTA will only be effective once the trust deficit has been addressed. 2, I don't think that everything we do in this ecosystem to preventing terrorism should be securitized in that sense. So we can go about doing our own things, not necessarily with the sole target of preventing extremism or terrorism. What works here will not work, for example, in the UK. I mentioned education is one of those structural factors, and Eric talked about religious schools and madrasas and all that. If you look at the people who are going to Iraq and Syria from the West, many are educated. They come from private education, middle-class families, seemingly solid backgrounds. Over here, I think it's a little more nuanced. Yes, we have an education system that works, but does that education system, whether secular or religious, encourage critical thinking? Now, I think the whole concept of critically dissecting ideas hasn't been firmly grounded in the Malaysian system. In fact, in some places it's discouraged, especially when religious questions come at play. And I think we have to revisit the true intellectual tradition of religions like Islam, like the other Abrahamic faiths, that have always encouraged this critical discourse. And while you can have disagreements, you don't always have to be disagreeable. Mm-hmm. So it should be inculcated in our culture, in our intellectual culture, that it's okay to question as long as you do it in a civil manner, and not everything has to be emotional just because it's a religious issue.
Yeah.
If I can just fully support what Elina has said. The contrary is true in Malaysia, because when it comes to religion, everything is so sensitive. In fact, so sensitive that they have amended the Sedition Act to put somebody in jail for a minimum of 3 years if you were to raise issues of religious nature. So when it comes to countering the hearts and minds of why such people decide to do what they do, leave their family, leave all they have in Malaysia to actually go to Syria and Iraq, essentially to kill people, I think we have no choice but to discuss the essence, or at least the messages of religion, and how they are being disseminated.
But would Jakim allowed it?
Yes, so hence the need for not just one view on religion, and I think we need to change the discourse to not think that whatever disagreement we have on religion is necessarily an insult or a challenge on religion or the state authority. So they should look at it, take it in good faith that all of us.
But I would like to counter your view, because if you look at Singapore, which is a secular state, and you look at Indonesia, which it allows diversity of opinions, they also have equal amount of people joining ISIS. So is it really the state's role, to somehow educate, quote unquote, society, or is it? The root causes beyond just that? Does it include like the geopolitical struggle of the world right now? Is it also because the messages of so-called Islamic State has been embedded within the Muslim mind that resulted people to believe in it, even though they might consciously feel it's wrong?
I think the different layers that of motivations that drive individuals, from personal experiences that might have been traumatic, some of these are psychological, to local factors, dissatisfaction with the political situation, to a broader, as you mentioned, geopolitical environment that encourages pockets of inequities and poor governance that contribute to injustice. You look at a lot of the causes, essentially they're socio-political and economic. There is a lot of grievances being aired about failed states, weak governance in these countries. You look at countries like Iraq and Syria, Palestine, weak governance. And these factors are what fuel the religious messages that mask the true, root causes, as Eric mentioned. And I think, that how we respond to it should also be multi-pronged. Yes, religious messaging, counter narratives are important, but it's also really important to educate our youth that, what's going on in Iraq and Syria is essentially sectarian. And I'm not sure these kids even know what it means to be Sunni, to be Shia, and what the divisions really entail. So there has to be an education of the political situations that go on in these countries. And if necessary, then you throw in, religious counter narratives that go to addressing some of the justifications that are put in place.
But then
Then how about the bringing all the students from the Middle East country, back to Malaysia? Because the government really emphasized on bringing all the students from Yemen and Aden. So what's your view on that? And who will be the one who will actually take care of them once they arrive in Malaysia?
I think the bringing back of students from Yemen is because of the instability that's going on over there. But yes, there has to be. I think you should encourage a diversity of views on many issues, including on religion. So, you can have people who studied in Yemen, in Egypt, and all. But the important thing is to encourage a marketplace of ideas so that narratives can be debated, discussed in a civil manner. And there is a precedence for this in Islamic intellectual tradition. There's a term for it as well. So this is not alien to Islamic culture. I think dogma is. And so if these Muslims are going to remain true to their faith, then they should honor what has been so in the past.
Yeah, but the environment in Malaysia, as I said, it doesn't allow for such different views. I mean, if you look at some of the controversies over the last few years, even a short video, talking about hudud by BFM radio, led to rape threats, threats to kill a young Malay woman, an event to touch dogs. Some or other led to the similar sort of vilification against the organizer.
But this is not from the authorities, from ordinary Malaysians themselves, right?
Well, I think it's a bit of both, in the sense that the environment that has been set by the authorities over the last few decades allow for such vilification to happen when it suits the state authority, in the sense that Muslims are not supposed to touch dogs is consistent with the official government's school of thought, then yes, they would allow it. So when it comes to the BFM radio, for example, if it's suitable for them not to allow a discussion on hudud, for example, then they would not allow it. So I think the view when it comes to freedom of speech and information, when it comes to religion, it is very much politicized, and hence we don't have a very good fit discussion on Islam, for example, and hence and I think over the last few decades, it has led to the state where we are, whereby there seems to be only one message that is being allowed, and diversification of views are not welcome.
There's a news just released that the Dewan Negara, or the senators, also is deciding to debate about the issue, to analyze the POTA Act. Do you think maybe we should backtrack a bit and maybe member of parliaments and the executive as well needs to probably look into the POTA Act more seriously, and not just to prevent it being abused, but to ensure that it actually really address some of the key threats of terrorism, especially terrorist activities that is happening throughout this region, not just Malaysia. I mean, I give example of what had happened in the southern Philippines, where, you know, unfortunately the key mastermind was a Malaysian, Marwan. So, do you think POTA Act itself needs to probably dwell a bit deeper to somehow see whether it's effective or not to be used as a law to prevent terrorism?
Well, I mean, I would certainly think that this would be effective, but as to who, you know, so effective here could mean you know, not in a good way, in the sense that they can just arrest anyone, whether they're guilty or not, nobody knows. So they could just arrest 100 people, 1,000 people, and then they could say that this is effective. And there's no way of knowing it, verifying.
But would you suggest a different bill just to address the same thing?
Well, they have the SOSMA. I mean, the SOSMA and is in effect now, and in fact, there's a trial ongoing currently. So therefore, it's actually not correct to say that we need detention without trial to stop that.
So to you, SOSMA is a good enough law and fair enough law?
Well, SOSMA, we have our concerns with SOSMA, but at the very least, it would be a much better model than POTA, because at the end of the day, they still need to bring to court, even though there's some concerns regarding the rules of evidence and procedures.
Okay. And you, Elina?
To me, laws are essentially stopgap measures when we're talking about terrorism, and because of, you know, what it took Al Qaeda to do, to recruit, for example, let's say Al Qaeda took 6 months. Groups like IS and such are doing it in 6 weeks. So there is an increased urgency to do something concrete to prevent people from going over to commit, or even from staying in the country and committing acts of terror, because there are automatons now, right? You don't have to receive instruction from anywhere else. I think it's good that we're having a debate on POTA in civil society, and hopefully there will be a robust debate in the Dewan Negara. And I think this is a slow, but I think it's an encouraging sign of Malaysia as it democratizes even further. Maybe Eric might dispute the speed at which, you know, we're achieving our maturing democracy. But I think we have to take things slowly. You know, we certainly wouldn't have had this debate, say, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, maybe. And there's always room for improvement. But I think the fact that we're able to talk about this now, to debate the provisions of POTA, is itself an encouraging sign.
So you do think POTA can be improvised, or do you think POTA itself might lead to, you know, things that that is totally not related to terrorist activities?
I think there are provisions in POTA that can definitely be improved upon. There are provisions in there that raise some questions. You know, I brought up the issue of the inquiring officer. There's also, I wish there were a provision for judicial review of the substance, even if it's, you know, 2-3 years down the road, because at least there is a mechanism to assess whether a decision was made on solid substantive criteria or not. And perhaps, you know, there will be amendments to POTA to address some of these weaknesses. But it's important to have this debate about it.
With that, thank you very much, Eric Paulsen and also Elina.